Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about world affairs and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch, and in this show we discuss topical global issues and have in-depth conversations with personalities in foreign policy. Global Dispatches is presented in partnership with Humanity in Action, an international educational organization, and I am a Humanity in Action Senior Fellow. As I'm recording, nearly 400,000 ethnic Rohingya have fled Myanmar across the border to Bangladesh. And by the time you are listening to this, that number will almost surely be much, much higher. Since late August, security forces from the government of Myanmar, also called Burma, have attacked villages and towns in a seemingly coordinated fashion to create a massive displacement crisis. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has described what is happening as a, quote, textbook example of ethnic cleansing. On the line with me to discuss this current crisis is John Sifton, the Asia Advocacy Director of Human Rights Watch. We spoke just after he got off the phone with his colleagues on the Myanmar-Bangladesh border who have witnessed profound scenes of destruction. John also describes satellite imagery he's reviewed that depicts towns, villages, and neighborhoods being burned to the ground. John offers a useful background on the plight of the Rohingya population in Burma and explains why Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel laureate and de facto leader of the country, has been such a disappointment and either unwilling or unable to stop this onslaught against a minority community in her own country. We also discuss some opportunities and suggestions for how the international community might better confront this crisis. If you're a regular listener to the show, you know that I've done several episodes now on the Rohingya issue. You know, it's one of those under the radar global issues that I like to highlight from time to time. However, now it is very much in the headlines, though for all the wrong reasons. So this situation is pretty awful right now, and I'd like to do whatever I can to help raise awareness around it. So if you know someone who might benefit from learning a little bit more about the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar and Bangladesh, then please do share this episode with your friends and colleagues and post it to social media. Try to just raise some consciousness here. And of course, if you want to get in touch with me for any reason, if you have questions or comments or have suggestions of people I should interview or topics I should cover, please just use the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com or hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. All right, now here is my conversation with John Sifton of Human Rights Watch.
Well, the latest violence in Burma was not unexpected. For years, human rights groups and others have been warning of an explosive situation in Western Burma. It all goes back decades to a long-standing antipathy towards the local Rohingya Muslim population, who the local Rakhine Buddhist population have often resented and considered as interlopers from abroad, from Bangladesh, neighboring Bangladesh. They've been labeled as non-Burmese citizens. The fact that they've been Muslim has been brought up time and time again in ways to suggest that they're somehow involved in terrorism, even though there was no evidence of any type of violence on their part. But in 2012, violence broke out after rumors of a rape of a Buddhist woman by some Muslim men surfaced, and there was a conflagration that led to large-scale displacement. This is in 2012. Mm-hmm.
And that displacement was mostly communal violence, though, right? That was sort of winked at by the government.
Communal violence. Okay. I mean, I wouldn't call it communal violence because it wasn't like they were fighting, one-to-one. It was more like one community, the Rakhine Buddhist population, attacked another community, but they were helped by local security forces, police, and border police in the area who took part in the violence or stood by in the violence. But the bottom line is, after that violence, a lot of the Rohingya were displaced, and some of them were ghettoized. They were either sort of concentrated into certain neighborhoods, like in Sitwa. There's a ghetto in Sitwa where they're essentially ghettoized into a place they can't really leave.
And Sitwa is a city in Rakhine State.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then up north, near another city called Mungdao, that same thing. They're sort of isolated, but many of the internally displaced were also put in camps that also became ghettos. And then even those Rohingya who were still in their villages were subjected to huge travel restrictions and restrictions on their access to health, education. And so you had a very, very aggressive governmental posture towards the Rohingya from 2012 to until this August that was leading to enormous resentments. And it appears that what happened is Rohingya, a small number of Rohingya decided to form some kind of armed group. They weren't very well funded. They certainly aren't very well armed, but they engaged in an attack last October on an army post, which led to a disproportionate response where the Burmese military sort of mowed down a whole bunch of villages, torching them. We had satellite imagery and later testimony sort of demonstrating that the military went on a campaign where they burned down scores of villages, thousands of homes, and displaced hundreds of thousands of more.
And that was last October.
That was last October. But then, that kind of died down after a few weeks. Then another attack by this small, sort of poorly organized Rohingya insurgent group occurred in August. And August 25th, the Burmese military almost immediately launched another offensive, which is still going on to this day. This very morning that I'm talking to you, I was talking to our staffers on the Bangladesh-Burma border who can see across the River Naf directly into Mungdao Township in Burma, and they were describing, seeing before their very eyes, villages being burned on fire. And this, mind you, in the middle of the monsoon, when it isn't exactly easy to set things on fire. Everything is soaking wet.
So wait, can you tell me in a little more detail what exactly they were telling you on the phone, looking at this conflagration happen across the border?
Just unbelievable levels of human misery and degradation. Thousands of Rohingya are fleeing across the River Naf using whatever flotation they can, or swimming, or whatever, to get across the river into Bangladesh. The Bangladesh border authorities are not turning them back, although they were initially told to. And then they're walking through, mud. Again, it's the middle of the monsoon, so the whole place is soaking wet. They're walking through mud or submerged water, miles and miles to seek some kind of shelter in the nearby city of Teknaf, or even up at Cox's Bazar, another city in Bangladesh. And across the river in Mungdao, you can see villages, you can see housing structures on fire. And just given the level of moisture over the last few weeks, these fires have spread through several townships. We've been able to use satellite overflights that, in addition to taking images, also register infrared emissions. This is a technology that's used by NASA to detect forest fires. And the software and the hardware is designed in such a way that it only picks up large-scale fires. So where there's a big enough emission of infrared from a particular pixel of the satellite photograph, it will, register it as an intense fire, as a major fire, not like, a campfire or
like a forest fire. Leaves. Yeah.
But no, if you see it flagged on the satellite data, it's because in that pixel, in that kilometer area, there is an intense fire underway. So we're looking at these images, satellite overflight of all of the Indian subcontinent. 5 or 6 times a day, these satellite overflights are taking place. And the whole subcontinent is gray because it's the middle of the monsoon. But then there's this strip between the mountains and the river in Mungdao Township in Arakan Province in Burma, where it's red because it's on fire. It's a testimony to the fact that if you have that level of conflagration, given the moisture levels that are currently, the situation there, it's because somebody is intentionally burning this area. You can't have week in and week out fires of that intensity unless somebody's setting them and using accelerant, gasoline, or whatever to make them happen.
And so basically entire villages are being burned to the ground.
Portions of villages. I mean, this is the thing. So there are some villages where there are Muslims on one half of the village and Buddhists on the other, and you can see either whole villages where there's an entire Rohingya village being burned down, or in other like larger areas like Mungdao city itself, the entire Muslim quarter appears to have been burned down. And the level of displacement is far beyond anything we've seen since 2012. We're now talking about 300,000, 400,000 people crossed since August 25th.
So let me ask you about why that is the case. I mean, I've been following this issue. This is probably like the fourth episode that I've done on this podcast about the Rohingya issue. But it is the numbers we're talking about, the figures we're talking about are so much more dramatically higher this time around than say last October or during that Andaman Sea boat crisis from a few years ago as well. Why is it so much worse this time around? And I should say, as we are speaking, the latest UN figures were something like 370,000 people fled across the borders. But by the time this is published, that could be much, much higher, just because these numbers are dramatically increasing at a very rapid pace. So why is the scale so high right now?
It's absolutely true that the numbers have just gone off the charts. I mean, a source told our staff on the ground on the Bangladesh border today that they estimated 50,000 people crossed today from.
And we're recording this on Tuesday, the 12th.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's so much bigger now is almost certainly because there is now it's almost certainly because of the existence of this so-called insurgent group that carried out the attacks on August 25th that led to this violence. We believe that the Burmese government, the Burmese military, is now utilizing the existence of this group that attacked them as a fig leaf to carry out so-called security operations and cast the conflict as essentially a security operation, armed conflict situation where they are in a posture of fighting an enemy, this insurgent group, when in reality what's happening is they're carrying out ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity, attacks on a civilian population. If it turns out that we're right about that, if it turns out that this is part of a plan, a systemic effort to clear areas of Rohingya, that's crimes against humanity. That is a very, very serious level offense in international criminal law. And we're talking about this is the type of thing that was punished in the Yugoslavia tribunal.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like a textbook way in which governments commit ethnic cleansing is by using the pretext of an insurgent group to carry out reprisals against the entire community from which that insurgent group is drawn. I mean, you have it in Darfur.
Although this is more than reprisals. I mean, I think it's one thing to carry out reprisals that are aimed at beating back an enemy. It's another thing to carry out operations which appear to be designed to make an entire population leave an area never to return. And ethnic cleansing is a quasi-legal term. It's not a legal term as such, but it has been given meaning by jurisprudence in the Yugoslav tribunal. The more, but crimes against humanity is a legal term, and it has a very specific legal definition. And if you are carrying out a planned and systemic attack on a civilian population to clear it out of an area, that meets the definition of crimes against humanity, and it may meet the definition of genocide.
It seems, though, that as of now, the government of Burma is pretty successful in their efforts to rid the area of this minority population. So what's the total population size of Rohingya that are estimated to be living in Myanmar before this current crisis?
It's the estimates are very broad, but it's over 1 million.
So
Nobody knows for sure.
mm.
Nobody knows for sure.
So over
But
a million live there. So basically, a third of the population now seems to have been displaced over the border to Bangladesh.
if those numbers are if those numbers are correct, but given the lack of a reliable census in the last several decades, there's no way to know for sure exactly how many remain. But given the numbers at the levels they are and the small geographic area we're talking about, it's entirely possible that very soon you will have no Rohingya in large areas of this township, that essentially they will have been cleared out. I mean, because you can talk about the entire western state of Arakan, or you could just talk about Mungdao. Mungdao is the very north part of the state, and it's quite possible that very soon that entire township will be devoid of any Rohingya population.
So this latest violence is coming kind of amid what was at one point heralded as a democratic transition in Burma as a whole, with Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi as the kind of leader of the party that led this democratic transition of the country. So, how is it that she, although she's like she runs things behind the scenes, but she's not formally the president or prime minister, pardon me, of Burma. How is it that she seems so immune to international entreaties to put a stop on to this violence committed by her country's security forces? I mean, you've seen people around the world try to condemn her, call her out, but she doesn't seem to care much. Yeah.
It's actually probably a mistake to focus only on her, because there's two things. She has been an incredible disappointment because she has failed to condemn the violence, failed to use what power she has to compel the military to not engage in these abuses. With that said, it's not clear whether if she had done what we want, which is condemn the violence, order the military to stop, that the military would in fact stop. And that's because of a structural problem with the transition to democracy that we've been complaining about and talking about for years, which is that despite winning the elections, despite becoming the de facto head of state, the fact of the matter is Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD party that she runs, while having a majority of the population, parliament, does not have control over the Defense Ministry, Home Ministry, and Border Affairs Ministry, all of which are ultimately controlled by the Burmese military as such. In addition, 25% of the Burmese parliament is reserved for parliamentarians who are appointed by the military.
So that's obvious. The military obviously still, is a politically powerful force
Absolutely.
in the country.
Oh, and here's the rub. It is impossible to amend the Constitution to change all of this unless you have 76% of the parliament vote for it. So that 25% block that is controlled by the military is essentially a veto power over any constitutional amendment to change the Burmese constitution to allow Aung San Suu Kyi or whoever the president or state councilor is to run to make an amendment to the constitution. So she technically has control over the military, but in reality, the military makes their own decisions through something called the National Security and Defense Council. So Burma is essentially in a state of emergency, a de facto state of emergency. It's fighting 7 or 8 insurgencies. It's probably, there's no country in the world that is fighting more separate insurgencies than Burma. Mm-hmm. And so the military has this kind of outsized role.
So what political advantage does it serve the Burmese military to carry out this destructive campaign in Rakhine State against the Rohingya population?
Well, here's where it gets even more complex, because the fact of the matter is Rakhine is a separate ethnic area, right? So the central Burmese plateau, the sort of central plains of Burma, which Aung San Suu Kyi's government controls, are mostly ethnically Burman. Rakhine State is, or Arakan State as it's also called, is ethnically Rakhine. They're a different ethnic group from the Burmans, of which Aung San Suu Kyi is. These Buddhist Rakhine are some of the poorest ethnic, it was one of the poorest ethnic groups in Burma. they look down on the even poorer Rohingya Muslims with some hatred because they're poor, but these other people are taking what scant resources they have. For a long time, the central Burmese government, both the military, Aung San Suu Kyi, they didn't really care about any of these people because it's just this far-flung province out near Bangladesh. Nobody really cared. Back in 2012, when the violence broke out, the military came in and actually kept security. They weren't engaged in the violence. They came in and sort of played a part in sort of stopping the violence. This time around, however, things have changed. Now you have a situation where this little insurgent group attacked the Burmese military. So now they're mad, and now they view things a little bit differently. Secondly, anti-Muslim perceptions across the entire country have just grown and grown and grown in the last 4 or 5 years.
And they're already pretty strong to begin with historically. It's fair to say,
they were
right?
already pretty strong, but they were kind of lurking in the background. But it all got whipped up into a frenzy in the last 4 or 5 years as Buddhist nationalists and some of the Buddhist nationalist groups that there are, like the Mabata, which is this group of Buddhist monks that works to promote Buddhism and Buddhist nationalism across the state, have just ramped up this incredibly toxic anti-Muslim rhetoric about how Muslims are going to take over the country, that they're linked to Al-Qaeda, all this false claims. Now, a lot of people ask me, they have a kind of unsophisticated view of Buddhism. A lot of Westerners ask me, well, how could these Buddhists have such hateful attitudes?
Yeah, if there is no self, how could they hate? Yeah.
Right.
No.
but there's a deep misunderstanding of what Buddhism is in Asia, first of all. And second of all, the identity here is not Buddhist religion. It's as a group. And they're viewing themselves more. I would put the focus on nationalists. These are Burmese nationalists who see their Buddhist, heritage as part of their identity. Buddhism, the religion, is not really part of the equation. Yeah. It's a heritage and a sort of
as is often in these cases with any kind of religion and religious nationalism.
But be that whatever it is, it's intensified greatly, and so now I think the military is in more the mode of, look, this Rohingya crisis has just been a thorn in our side. Maybe it's time to just finish them off, the final solution. And that's what was so alarming about Min Aung Hlaing, the commander-in-chief, giving a talk last week where he said that what was going on now in Arakan was unfinished business from 1942 when the British withdrew from the area. This is a reference to the idea that all of these Rohingya are foreigners who the British brought in, and now it's time to essentially kick them back across the border to go back to Bangladesh from where they came. This is all fiction, but this is the narrative that they are promoting.
So this also all comes just like weeks after Kofi Annan released this report. He was, appointed, or he led this commission on the status of Rohingya and like the whole, the ethnic conflict between Rohingya and Burmese population. And he just released his report. It was this, there was like a specific name of the commission that's escaping me right now.
They call it the Rakhine population or the Annan Commission, but the violence broke out almost immediately after the release of the report. Some people think that this little insurgent group, this little Rohingya insurgent group that carried out these small attacks, was, waiting for that report, and they were sort of using this report as a moment to attack and whip things up. Well, for their part, by the way, they deserve some of the blame because, God knows if you're a downtrodden minority that's being persecuted, engaging in an insurgent operations against the people who are oppressing you is something that you can be almost certain will result in retaliations against your ethnic group. So I guess they made a decision that was the right thing to do, but I wouldn't have.
So can you talk about the substance of this report? Because as I've followed Kofi Annan's career for a while. He's politically astute and thoughtful. So I have to imagine there's probably some good nuggets contained in this report and in recommendations. So what did it recommend in terms of reducing or mitigating this simmering conflict?
It had a whole slew of recommendations that were technical in nature, but all of them quite excellent, that went to the real heart of what was driving the resentment and anger of the Rohingya population and the Rakhine population. So, for instance, the citizenship issue. It is very, the citizenship of the Rohingya is very uncertain under Burma's highly problematic 1982 citizenship law. It is not easy, if you're a Rohingya, to obtain documentation of your citizenship, even if you're entitled to it under international human rights law. You're born in Burma, raised in Burma, your parents were born in Burma. You are a Burmese citizen under international human rights law, but you're not under Burma's highly problematic 1982 citizenship law.
They call them Bengali, right? Like they're...
Yeah, that's... it's basically like you're a group that, if you're Bengali, so to speak, if you can show that you're descended from family who were there before 1860 something, then you're entitled to citizenship. And they've created an associate citizenship type where you sometimes avail yourself of it, but it's still very difficult to obtain. So Kofi Annan made some recommendations about how to fix citizenship law so that underlying identity issue wouldn't be consistently bedevil the situation. On top of that, there's the issue of the travel restrictions and the restrictions on access to healthcare and economic opportunity. I mean, I think the Annan Commission recognized quite correctly that the Rohingya population couldn't ever integrate or be integrated unless they're allowed to move around and farm and take their goods to market and go to a hospital and receive healthcare and everything else. This pressure to ghettoize them and separate them from the rest of the population was not going to lead to stability in the long term.
And so what else?
And then there were things about
ahead.
It's just about reconciliation. I mean, basically facilitating communities, leaders being brought together to communicate and talk about ways forward. To move past the tensions and start thinking about how these two communities can reconcile.
And so
very difficult work, but he made some good practical recommendations for how to lead that forward.
Well, and so what can the international community at large right now be doing better to, I suppose, pressure the government of Myanmar to halt its ongoing violence against its own people, it's the Rohingya people? Like, what else can the international community do?
Well, the international system has condemned and pressured already. They've issued very strong statements of concern and everything else. The time now is to talk about hard consequences. It's time for the United States and the European Union, which used to maintain sanctions on military leaders and military-owned enterprises and the military as an institution, to consider reimposing those sanctions and reimposing treasury and financial restrictions that make it difficult for those people to avail themselves of the international financial system. Travel restrictions, visa and entry bans for Burmese people implicated in the violence. And it's time to start talking about reimposing a lot of those economic and asset
both like
freezes,
bilateral and also like UN sanctions as well.
Bilateral to start, because the U.S. and the EU could make these decisions quicker. But at the UN level, to talk about a UN Security Council resolution with sanctions on Burmese officials is something we're pushing for. But given the Chinese and Russia vetoes at the Security Council, it'll be very difficult to obtain something like that in the immediate future. Maybe down the line.
Why would they have an interest in this one, one way or the other?
Well, they're always reluctant to have country-specific resolutions that impose sanctions. It's even hard to get them on, North Korea. Mm-hmm. It's even hard to get them on a country which Russia and China don't even care about that much, like, say, South Sudan. Although, actually, China does South Sudan.
Yeah.
But in any case, it's hard, always, but it's especially hard. China would seek to protect Burma. And Russia would just seek to undermine, U.S. influence at the Security Council. So it's always difficult to get those sanctions. But that's what we're working for. I mean, I think it's time to talk about an arms embargo on Burma and and sanctions. An arms embargo wouldn't have a huge impact, but because the fact of the matter is most of the arms are obtained from the Chinese and would continue to be sold probably on the black market. And in fact, Burma even has its own armaments industry domestically, but it would send a strong message if an arms embargo was slapped on them.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time and your insights. This was very helpful.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to John. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, please do share this episode. Do what you can to raise awareness around this issue. This is one of those slow burning global crises that have become very, very hot in recent weeks and shows no real sign of abating. So just get some knowledge around it. Do what you can to learn about this crisis. I think it behooves all of us as humans to know about these kinds of rampant human rights violations that are going on in a distant part of the world. If that part of the world is distant to you, if you're in Bangladesh or listening to this in Myanmar or the region, then just do what you can to further raise awareness around this issue. All right, thank you all, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of Humanity in Action.